Player agency is an interesting thing, and we can talk about what it is and what it isn't and get into the semantics of it. I've got some common advice that I like to talk about, and so I shot a bunch of shorts. And so I'm going to do a supercut that goes over some of the top 5 pieces of advice or ideas behind player agency. Because in reality, player agency is simply a matter of when the players feel like they have choice and their actions make an impact. That doesn't mean in the grand scheme of things, but let's take a look at some of the different things that can or affect player agency, or some of the common things that come up. Let's talk about it. Let's talk a second about player agency, because there seems to be some confusion around it, and we keep making videos on it. The easiest explanation that I can give for player agency is this: players having choice, and those choices mattering, meaning that they actually have an impact. Now, what it doesn't mean is that every choice your player makes has to impact the world. Remember, level 1 players aren't going to make global impacts, but maybe they make minor impacts. Also, players having the ability to choose. That doesn't mean the initial outcome is necessarily different, but it means and where they go is different. And the reason I make those clarifications is because player choice and what the dungeon master have programmed or planned can have a variance. So remember that. If your players have choice and their actions matter, they have agency. It is that simple, kind of. Even when you have player agency, sometimes your actions don't matter, meaning not at that moment. And this always comes into account when we're talking about the quantum ogre. If I choose to go down path A or path B and I encounter the same encounter, then I don't have agency. That's not entirely true. That one encounter may be the same, but where you end up is simply different. You still have agency. The dungeon master simply can't prepare for everything. Later on, that agency returns as dungeon masters get better at their job, better at their craft, and all of a sudden, when you go down this path to the forest, now you're fighting the ogre in the forest. When you go down this path, now you're fighting the ogre near the river. It gets better. Then all of a sudden, you're fighting a forest ogre that's been reskinned and rethemed, or you're fighting a river ogre. Either way, you're getting to find an ogre. The difference is now your agency does make a difference because the ogre is a different challenge. Now we've returned a little bit of your agency, but still using the quantum ogre. Let's talk a second about how to remove player agency so we know what not to do. When your players make decisions in the player agency removed, it means their actions don't matter. The simplest example that I can give is something that happened to me when we knew an item that we had was trying to be stolen by a wizard. So we put every precaution into place, but yet the item was still stolen regardless of those precautions. It didn't matter what we did. The dungeon master came up with a way to remove that. Even though we had a well thought out plan, there was always one thing more the dungeon master could do. The thing is what we put in place had no effect at all. It's one thing to say, yes, your bad guy is so powerful he can step in to the area, steal the item, and leave. But our actions had no bearing on the outcome. They didn't affect it. They didn't give us a fighting chance. The thing just happened. At the time, it happened without explanation. This is the beginning of removal of player agency. Sometimes, not always. Most of the time when we remove player agency, we're also talking about railroading, meaning the players choose to go to a dock, but they're choosing to go to Island A instead of Island B. No matter what they choose, they end up shipwrecked and on this other island, regardless of what they've decided. Now, what about when the players have taken precautions? They've watched for storms, they've got a mage, they've done a storm caller, they've gotten everything right, and they still end up going. When the players feel like their actions don't matter, their agency has been removed. And this is the weird thing. It's about feeling. If I feel like I chose to go to player A and we were shipwrecked, we ended up on this different island, if I feel like my actions still matter, but yet I still end up on the same place, I still have agency. Now, we can talk semantics, we can talk about whether that's real or not, but the bottom line is it's not a problem as long as your players feel like what they've done makes a difference. So all their planning gives them an edge when they end up shipwrecked. Keep that in mind if you need your players to get somewhere. The reality of player agency is as follows. If your players feel like their actions matter, whether they do or not, your players have player agency, because this never comes up. When your players feel like they are out of control and nothing they do actually makes a difference or has an impact on the world, good or bad, the players feel like they don't have player agency. And while we can talk about the cut and dry of when players do have agency, the bottom line is if they feel like they're out of control, then it feels like they don't have agency. What player agency is not is if they get to roll their dice or not. That has nothing to do with player agency, regardless of what you think. That is the one thing that removal player agency is not. If I roll for my players behind the thing, it may be less fun, but it has nothing to do with agency. But Richard, you said when they feel like out of control, you don't feel like you're out of control if you don't get to roll your dice. Credit. I like my math rocks too. Remember, player agency is when you feel like your actions have no bearing on the world.